The morning began like any other for the farmer, gray clouds hanging low, the air heavy with the smell of damp earth and hay. He was used to silence out here, the kind that feels alive, pressing against your thoughts until they echo back at you. The field stretched endlessly, pale gold under the fading dawn, and the only sound was the creak of the old windmill turning slowly against the wind. But then he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. It wasn't an animal, not the wind, not the rustle of leaves. It was human, soft, broken, and trembling. A sob. He froze mid-step, the wooden bucket in his hand dripping water onto his boots. For a moment he thought he imagined it, that it was some trick of the morning breeze. But then it came again, clearer this time, and closer. A woman's voice, not crying out, but whispering like someone too tired to be loud anymore. He set the bucket down and followed the sound past the barn, through the narrow path leading to the back of the property. His heart beat faster with every step, the mud gripping his boots as if trying to hold him back. When he reached the old oak tree near the fence line, he stopped. There, kneeling in the damp grass, was a woman. Her coat was torn at the shoulders, one sleeve ripped, her hair tangled and streaked with mud. She was young, maybe 20, 21 at most, but her eyes looked far older. They were the kind of eyes that had seen too much, the kind that no one that young should carry. In her shaking hands was a small pistol, silver dulled by rain. The farmer's breath caught in his throat. The world seemed to shrink until there was only the two of them, her, fragile and desperate, and him, standing just far enough away to feel useless. When she finally noticed him, she didn't scream or hide the gun. She just looked at him, as if she already knew what he'd do. Her voice came out cracked, barely more than a whisper. "Please, end my pain." He didn't answer at first. He couldn't. Something inside him, something deep and half-forgotten, stirred at those words. He saw not just her, but a reflection of every quiet sorrow he'd buried over the years. He took a slow step forward, then another, until he was close enough to see her tears mix with the rain on her cheeks. He didn't reach for the gun. Instead, he knelt down beside her, not above her, not in command, but beside her, at eye level. His voice was calm when he finally spoke. "If you want to die," he said softly, "then first let me show you what it's like to live." For the first time in a long while, the wind stopped. The world went still, as if even the earth itself was holding its breath. And that was the moment everything changed. The walk back to the farmhouse was silent. The farmer didn't take the gun from her hands, she had already dropped it, as if it no longer held the same power it did minutes ago. The rain had turned to a fine mist, clinging to her lashes and his coat, softening the world into gray stillness. She followed him like someone walking out of a dream, her steps unsteady but willing. When they reached the porch, he held the door open and motioned her inside without a word. She hesitated, eyes darting between him and the horizon behind her, as if weighing whether safety was worth the risk of trust. Finally, she stepped over the threshold. The inside smelled of wood smoke, bread, and dust. It wasn't a grand home, just a small, time-worn farmhouse with a stone fireplace and a table that had seen too many lonely dinners. A kettle whistled faintly in the corner, the air carrying the scent of chamomile. He hung his hat by the door, unbuttoned his coat, and said the first words since the field. "Sit by the fire. You're cold." She didn't respond, but the look she gave him said enough: confusion, disbelief, fear. She sat, her soaked clothes leaving dark marks on the rug. Her hands wouldn't stop trembling. He poured 2 cups of tea, setting one in front of her. "It'll warm you up," he said gently. "No need to talk yet." Her eyes met his for the first time without tears. They were wary, yes, but somewhere deep inside, there was a flicker of something else. Something still alive. Minutes passed. The clock on the wall ticked softly. Outside, the storm began to ease, its last raindrops sliding down the window like sighs. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse. "Why did you bring me here?" He looked into the fire, the orange glow painting his face in quiet lines of exhaustion and compassion. "Because I've learned," he said, "that when someone's ready to end it all, they don't need someone to argue. They just need someone to sit beside them, until the shaking stops." Her breath caught, and for a moment, she couldn't look at him. No one had ever spoken to her like that, not as a stranger to be fixed, but as a soul worth staying with. She turned her face to the flames, eyes unfocused, and whispered, "You don't even know my name." He smiled faintly. "You don't need to tell me tonight." The warmth from the fire reached her cheeks, and slowly, her shoulders loosened. She sipped the tea, wincing at the unfamiliar comfort. When she finally drifted to sleep in the chair, her hands still shook slightly, but her breathing was calm. The farmer sat across from her, elbows on his knees, watching the rise and fall of her chest as the fire dimmed to embers. For the first time in years, the farmhouse felt full again, not of words or noise, but of presence. And though he didn't yet know her story, he knew one thing for certain: the woman he found beneath the oak tree wasn't meant to die. She was meant to begin again. Morning arrived softly, the kind of dawn that didn't break but unfolded, like a secret told gently. Pale sunlight crept through the curtains, falling across the woman's face as she slept in the old armchair by the fire. The embers had cooled to ash, but the faint warmth still lingered, wrapping her in its memory. The farmer stood by the kitchen counter, his hands steady as he poured fresh coffee into a tin mug. He didn't want to wake her, not yet. There was something sacred about the silence, the fragile peace that had settled after the night storm. Outside, the world was reborn. The fields glistened under dew, every blade of grass trembling with morning light. His dog, Scout, waited quietly by the door, tail wagging once before lying down again, sensing the unspoken weight that hung in the air. The woman stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, confusion flickering first, then recognition. For a second, fear rose again. She wasn't used to waking somewhere safe. But the smell of coffee and the faint crackle of the fire grounded her. She sat up slowly, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. "You can rest longer if you want," the farmer said without turning. His voice was calm, low, a sound that filled the room like warmth itself. She shook her head, clearing her throat. "No. I've already slept too long." He smiled faintly, pouring another mug and sliding it across the table toward her. "Then drink. It'll help." She hesitated before taking it, her fingers brushing his for the briefest moment, and in that instant, she noticed how steady his hands were. He was calm in the way people are when they've known loss and made peace with it. The coffee was strong, almost bitter, but it woke something inside her. She looked around, the walls lined with old photographs, shelves of books worn from use, a hat hanging by the window. This place wasn't rich in money, but it was rich in living. After a long silence, she finally spoke. "You live alone?" He nodded. "For a while now." "Your family?" she asked carefully. "Gone," he said, simply. "The land keeps me company." She didn't press further. Something in his tone told her the details were buried too deep for morning talk. Instead, she glanced out the window. "It's beautiful here," she murmured. "Peaceful." He followed her gaze. "It is. But peace only means something if you can feel it." Those words stayed with her. They hung between them as she helped him with breakfast, her movements hesitant, his patient. She cracked eggs with clumsy hands, burning the first one, and he chuckled softly. It was the first hint of lightness since they'd met. When she smiled, a small, unsure smile, the farmer felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. Not desire. Not even hope. Just, the recognition of another heart beating beside his own. And though neither said it aloud, both understood something quiet and powerful. The hardest part of surviving wasn't living another day, it was allowing yourself to believe you deserved to. By the fourth day, the rhythm between them had begun to take shape. She rose early now, drawn to the calm that wrapped the farmhouse in the blue light before sunrise. Sometimes she found the farmer already outside, standing at the edge of the wheat field with his hat low, a silhouette against the pale horizon. He didn't move much, just watched the wind ripple through the stalks like waves on a golden sea. She started to notice things about him. The way he paused before answering questions, as if weighing each word. The way his eyes softened whenever she laughed, rare, but real. And the way he carried silence, not as a burden, but as something earned. It was on one of those mornings that she finally asked. "Why are you always out there so early?" He smiled faintly. "Habit. Used to stand here with someone else." Her brow furrowed. "Your wife?" He nodded, eyes still fixed on the horizon. She liked to watch the sun rise. Said it made her feel like the world hadn't given up yet. There was a long pause. The wind rustled between them. "She's gone?" the woman asked softly. He nodded again. "Years ago. Took her longer to leave the world than it should have. Sickness doesn't take mercy on the good ones." She didn't know what to say. The grief in his voice wasn't sharp anymore, it was worn smooth, like a river stone. Still heavy, but shaped by time. He turned toward her, his expression steady but kind. "You don't have to talk about your pain yet. Just, don't keep it all to yourself forever. It eats at you from the inside." Her throat tightened. "You make it sound easy." "It isn't," he said simply. "That's why we help each other carry it." She looked away, blinking back sudden tears. No one had ever told her that before, that pain could be shared, not erased. As the morning stretched on, she helped him repair a fence by the barn. The sun climbed higher, glinting off the nails he hammered into the posts. Her hands were clumsy, but he didn't correct her harshly. When she stumbled over a loose plank, his hand caught her elbow, steady, firm, protective. The touch lingered a moment longer than necessary. It wasn't romantic. It was something deeper, human connection rediscovered in its purest form. Later, as they rested on the porch with lemonade in hand, she asked, "Why did you stop me that day, by the oak?" He looked at her, eyes shadowed but sincere. "Because I've seen what death takes, and what it leaves behind. I wasn't going to let it take you too." Her lip trembled. For the first time, she didn't look away. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was full, heavy with meaning. Two people who had both stood too close to loss, now breathing the same fragile hope. As dusk settled over the fields, she realized something she hadn't dared to before: the man who saved her wasn't just saving her life, he was quietly teaching her how to forgive it. The days began to find their rhythm. Mornings filled with the low hum of chores, boots against soil, the creak of wooden gates, the scent of hay and damp earth after dawn. The woman started to move differently now, slower, but with purpose. Her steps no longer dragged, they carried quiet determination. The farmer noticed it but said nothing. He'd learned that healing was something you didn't interrupt, you just gave it space to happen. One morning, while she tried to shoo a stubborn hen back into its pen, she slipped in the mud and landed squarely on her back with a startled gasp. The farmer turned from across the yard, half ready to help, but then she began to laugh. It was small at first, uncertain, like she'd forgotten how. But it grew, light and genuine, spilling into the air and cutting through weeks of silence. The farmer stopped in his tracks. He hadn't heard that sound, laughter, in this place for years. It startled him more than thunder ever could. He smiled, wide and unguarded, and shook his head. "Well," he said, chuckling, "looks like the hens finally won one." She wiped her face with her sleeve, still laughing. "They're meaner than they look. That's what keeps them alive," he replied, handing her a rag to clean her hands. That shared laugh changed something between them. It was small, a thread of warmth in the cold fabric of their days, but it stayed. After that, they began talking more easily, about small things, the weather, the stubbornness of animals, the silly superstitions of the town she'd left behind. One afternoon, while they worked by the fence, she cut her palm on a bit of rusted wire. She hissed and drew her hand back quickly, a drop of blood forming. The farmer set down his tools and came closer. "Let me see," he said softly. She hesitated, but offered her hand. His fingers were rough but gentle as he wrapped a clean strip of cloth around hers. The warmth of his touch steadied her. "You don't have to do everything alone," he murmured as he tied the knot. Her voice was almost a whisper. "It's how I survived." He looked up at her, eyes kind but firm. "Maybe it's time to learn a new way." For a moment, neither moved. The space between them hummed, not with desire, but with understanding. A connection deeper than words, quiet and steady. That evening, as the sun sank into the horizon, they sat on the porch again. The fields glowed gold beneath the fading light. She rested her bandaged hand on her lap, watching the wind move through the crops. "I used to think laughter was gone," she said softly. He smiled, watching the same horizon. "It's never gone. It just waits until we remember we're still allowed to use it." She turned to him then, and in her gaze was something new, not gratitude alone, but recognition. As if she finally saw him not just as the man who saved her, but as the one quietly keeping her heart company while it found its way back to life. That night, when the farmhouse lights dimmed, the silence felt different, no longer empty, but peaceful. And for the first time in years, both of them fell asleep with the quiet rhythm of shared laughter echoing faintly in their dreams. For weeks, life had begun to resemble something close to peace. The woman smiled more easily now. She worked beside the farmer without fear, her laughter blending with the sound of the windmill and the soft clucking of hens. Each sunrise felt like a small promise kept, fragile but real. But healing rarely moves in straight lines. Sometimes, the past waits until the heart begins to trust again, then strikes hardest. It began with small things. She woke in the night more often, gasping for breath. Once, the farmer found her standing by the window long after midnight, staring into the darkness beyond the fields. When he softly called her name, she only whispered, "Sometimes I hear them." He didn't ask who they were. He just nodded, offered her a cup of water, and stayed by the doorway until she slept again. A few days later, she grew quiet. The energy that once filled her steps drained away. When he tried to joke as they gathered eggs that morning, she barely smiled. By evening, the change was impossible to ignore. She disappeared. The farmer noticed her absence when the last light of day began to fade. Her shawl was missing from the hook, the door left slightly ajar. His pulse quickened. Without thinking, he grabbed his lantern and headed toward the oak tree, the place where it all began. And there she was. She stood in the same spot where he'd found her weeks ago, the wind catching strands of her hair, her dress fluttering faintly against the dying light. She wasn't crying this time, she was too still for that. Just staring into the dark horizon, as if something inside her was pulling her back to that moment, to the edge she'd once nearly stepped over. He stopped a few paces behind her, his voice calm but steady. "Why here?" Her reply was a whisper carried by the wind. "Because this is where I stopped feeling anything. And sometimes I think maybe that's where I belong." He took another step forward. The grass rustled under his boots, the lantern's glow trembling across her face. "You don't belong to your pain," he said quietly. "You just got lost in it." She shook her head. "You don't understand. I ruined everything. I hurt people I loved. I ran." He set the lantern down and wrapped his coat around her shoulders. "I understand more than you think. I lost someone too, and for a long time, I thought it was my fault. But guilt doesn't bring them back. It just keeps you from ever finding yourself again." Her breath hitched, and before she could speak, he did something simple. He stepped closer and placed his hand on her back, steady and firm. You don't have to talk tonight, he said softly. Just, don't leave me alone in this world again. That broke her. The tears came fast, unstoppable. She turned into him, her body trembling as he wrapped his arms around her, holding her not like someone fragile, but like someone worth keeping safe. The gun she once carried lay somewhere in the mud, half buried and forgotten under the roots of the old oak. And though the storm had returned, this time she wasn't facing it alone. Morning crept in slowly, gentle and gray, as if the world itself was trying not to disturb the quiet inside the farmhouse. The storm had passed some time before dawn, leaving the earth soaked and glistening. Raindrops clung to the windows, catching the pale light like small fragments of glass. The woman sat wrapped in a wool blanket on the porch steps, her bare feet brushing the wet wood. She looked out at the fields, the same fields that had once seemed endless and empty, now shimmering under a thin veil of mist. The smell of damp soil and wildflowers filled the air. Behind her, the screen door creaked open. The farmer stepped out, holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to her, his fingers brushing hers briefly, steady and warm. Didn't sleep much, he asked. She smiled faintly. Didn't need to. They sat together in silence, listening to the birds that had already begun to sing again, their voices thin but certain. The kind of sound that makes you believe the world has forgiven itself overnight. For a long time, neither spoke. The weight of the night before hung between them, not heavy, but sacred. The kind of silence that only follows after breaking open and surviving. Finally, she said softly, I went back there last night, to that tree, because I thought I needed to face the place where everything ended. He nodded, eyes on the horizon. And did you? She turned her face toward him, the morning light soft against her features. No, she said. Because it didn't end there after all. Something inside him eased, a long, quiet exhale he hadn't realized he'd been holding since the day he found her. She set her cup down, pulling the blanket closer. You didn't end my pain, she continued. You taught me to carry it without letting it drown me. He looked at her, really looked, not as a stranger he'd once rescued, but as someone who had walked through fire and learned to breathe again. I didn't teach you, he said gently. You just needed someone to remind you that you were still strong enough. The morning sun began to break through the clouds then, streaking the fields with gold. The wet earth steamed faintly, and the wind that swept through the wheat sounded like an exhale, the land itself waking up. She reached over, resting her hand on top of his. It was a simple gesture, but in it lived every unspoken word between them, gratitude, trust, maybe even the beginning of love. Will you stay? He asked quietly. She thought for a long moment, eyes tracing the horizon. For a while, she said at last. Long enough to plant something. He smiled at that, the kind of smile that comes from the deepest part of a man who's known both loss and grace. Together, they watched the light climb higher, spilling across the land like forgiveness itself. And in that golden silence, somewhere between grief and renewal, 2 souls who had once stood on the edge finally began again.